Everybody. We're still in the morning time, even though my clock reads 11:24 right now. The task for right now is to look at this recent article from the New York Times, which is the most extensive interview with Anthony Fauci, and so obviously this has implications for all of us because we've all lived through this plandemic now for the past 3 years. And obviously, this pandemic is still not over. Not only is the pandemic itself not over, or the plandemic, but the implications and the residue of it is clearly not finished and will never be finished within our lifetimes. So, for those reasons, and since this guy was basically the head of what happened in the United States, and then therefore what happened in the rest of the world, in 99% of the rest of the world, I think this article is potentially very important. Now, I'm not saying that it's going to be truthful because I don't think he deals much in truth. So I want to look at this article, and furthermore, obviously, New York Times is total garbage. So, but this is the way that public opinion is shaped. Public opinion is shaped by these big publications. New York Times is the exemplar of these. And Fauci is the ringleader he's the puppet master for the population. So a lot of people will go along with whatever gets published in the New York Times and with whatever he says in kind of a blank check fashion. So they'll say, oh, well, it was published in the New York Times. Just like doctors will accept anything that gets published in JAMA, British Medical Journal, Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, Archives of Internal Medicine, they'll take anything that comes out of those journals and they'll go with it because they believe in the process and they believe in this scientific thing, which now is just completely worthless. I mean, big science is dead. Over the last couple of years, and I think that's perfectly clear and obvious to everybody. So we're going to look at this article as if, so here's, if you want to kind of couch this or frame this, imagine that you and I meet for coffee or hot chocolate in this case. I've already had 2 coffees. First one was very weak, second one was better, and now I've got hot chocolate, Colombian hot chocolate, I might say, with clove and cinnamon. So let's imagine that we're meeting for coffee and we're about to have coffee or hot chocolate, and you and I are going to sit across from hopefully a real marble table, not plastic, and discuss this article. And I would say to you, well, let's read it together. You haven't read it, I haven't read it. Let's look at it together and see what we say, see what we think about it, and kind of come up with an answer. I would also have to couch that entire conversation with the fact that I'm waiting on a contractor to show up. So if I get a message or a call or a knock on the door from a contractor, then I'll have to pause the video and go down and attend to that. It could happen, call it 11:30 right now. It could happen anytime between now and 2 o'clock. So hopefully I'll be able to get through this review. So let's assume that you and I have the morning free and we're going to meet for coffee and talk about this article. And let's look at it together. At least you can imagine a scenario like that. Okay, so I haven't read this. I did start to read it because I thought, well, I'll read it first and then I'll just give you my summary. But it starts out horrible, and I just decided to do a complete video. So in the world of lectures and conversations, this is going to be what's called a long form, which means we're going to grind through every word of it. And then, for some of you, that'll be too long. So if you want to just skip to the end of the video, you can do that. I'll probably provide some summary or overview at that point. But we're going to go long form on this, and it's a long article. So this could take easily an hour. And I almost hate to spend that much time on it's kind of like fraud squared. So it's this guy who's a complete fraud, in my opinion, coming from a journalistic source that's also a complete fraud. But like I said, we have to know. So if you believe that he's correct in what he's done, then this is worth your time. If you believe that the New York Times is a good source of information, then this is worth your time. If you believe the opposite, that he's a fraud and the New York Times is garbage and it's just propaganda, then this is still worth your time, because even if you hate it, you still have to know what's going on in the world. And this is the world that we live in. It's controlled by mass media, and it's controlled by these types of politicians. So no matter where you are in the spectrum of agreement or disagreement, belief, disbelief, liberal, conservative, right, left, whatever you want to call yourself, Democrat, Republican, whatever, all those labels that mean nothing, then regardless of kind of where you are in the scheme of things, this is worth our collective time. So let's just do it. I'll try to go fast, but I am going to be somewhat analytical. And I guess I have kind of a casual mode of living where I'm just doing normal stuff. And then I have a somewhat analytical mode. So I'm going to go into analytical mode right now. I'm just going to give you my opinions as I go through them. I'm just going to kind of mirror to you what I see being presented in this article. Okay, so let's start with the picture. So they're obviously trying to set a very serious tone and a very kind of noble tone. So it's black and white. They're trying to dehumanize him in a way. With the black and white, the drama of this black and white picture. You can see he's got his head up slightly. So he's kind of looking down his nose at whoever. And he's a short guy anyway. He's a small man. So he's kind of looking down his nose a little bit and adjusting his tie as if he's being so proper. So that's part of, they didn't do a color picture. They didn't do him in a more casual, they didn't picture him or photo him in a more casual position. So, everything is communication, and this is part of the communication. They're trying to get across the impression that he's kind of noble, he's looking down on people, he's adjusting himself to be very proper. I mean, that's what they're communicating here. So let's get through that. Dr. Fauci looks back. Something clearly went wrong. So this is going to be I expect, so here come my biases. My biases are, first of all, that New York Times is garbage publication, garbage journalism, just corporate garbage, propaganda. He's going to propagandize himself to make himself look good. And what else? Probably not claim any responsibility for the millions or hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths. So certainly hundreds of thousands of deaths within the United States, but American policy becomes global policy very quickly because a lot of countries respect the image that America has had in the past. So that's part of it. They respect the United States based on past accomplishments and whatever, and what they think is a great country. But the other thing is American policy gets forced onto other countries through trade agreements and things like that. So, for the past 20 years, we've had this phrase in the political landscape, which is harmonization. Things have to harmonize and resonate and be equal across the globe. Well, a lot of countries don't want that. But in American conversations and politics, and in the European Union as well, when they say harmonize, there's no harmony involved in it. They're forcing their policies on other countries through military intimidation, through trade embargoes, something that you have to see. If you've paid attention over the past 50 years, and I do mean that, if you've paid attention to global politics, even a little bit over the past 50 years, then you know how American foreign policy works. America, even private businesses based in the United States will go to other countries to extract resources like tin or precious metals, what was it in Vietnam? In Vietnam, I think it was tungsten. That was the commercial interest in Vietnam, and part of the reason that America got into the Vietnam War was because I think they wanted the tungsten that was important at that time for the electronics industry. Well, same thing, you can say the same thing that happened in Chile when the United States overthrew democracy in Chile that was September 11, 1973, as I recall. And they said they were defending American interests. Well, defending American commercial private interests in a democratic country shouldn't mean overthrowing the democracy in that country, which is exactly what happened. So, again, like I'm saying, and I'm not trying to make that the conversation of today, but commonly what happens is an American company with some political power will enter into a foreign country, and then when that country refuses to hand over its resources, if that company has enough political interests or connections, then someone will declare that they have to go in to defend American interests in another country, even though it's not American interests. These are private corporations. They'll go in to defend private kind of capitalist interests under the name of the United States and using obviously American military force and troops. And they'll go in there and try to overthrow democracy.
We economic hitmen have managed to create the world's first truly global empire, and it's basically a secret empire. We do it many ways, but principally we identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sisters. The money never actually goes to the country. It goes to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in that country that help a few very wealthy people, but don't benefit the majority of the people who are too poor to buy electricity or have cars to drive on the highways, and yet they're left holding a huge debt that they can't repay. So we go back at some point and say, you know, you can't pay your debts. Give us a pound of flesh, sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies. Vote with us on the next critical UN vote. Allow us to build a military base in your backyard. Something along these lines. And when we fail, the jackals go in and either overthrow or assassinate these leaders. And if the jackals fail, as they did in Iraq, then we send in the military. I don't think the failure is capitalism. I think it's a specific kind of capitalism that we've developed. We've created what I consider a mutant, viral form of capitalism. And this mutant form of capitalism, which I think is really a predatory form of capitalism, has created an extremely unstable, unsustainable, unjust, and very, very dangerous world. I've met a lot of terrorists. I've interviewed them for books. I've never met one who wanted to be a terrorist. They're desperate people. If we want to get rid of terrorism, we must get rid of the root causes, that cancer that is destroying our whole system. Because I think it's really important that we understand today we cannot have homeland security unless we understand that the whole planet is our homeland.
So, again, what happens in the United States gets broadcast across the globe through trade agreements and harmonization, trade embargoes, military force, military bases, and the protection of American interests. So let's look at how America's policy became global policy very quickly. In his most extensive interview yet, Anthony Fauci wrestles with the hard lessons of the pandemic and the decisions that will define his legacy. I could care less about his legacy. So, like I said, I just started to read this a few minutes ago. I looked at the first line, literally, and it was already propaganda. It was perhaps an impossible job. No, it was not an impossible job. What was this? So this was a highly contagious, but not even that highly contagious. It was a contagious respiratory virus, possibly created through gain-of-function research funded by the United States taxpayers in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They published the data in 2016. It's a publicly available document showing that they designed and synthetically engineered a pathologic coronavirus that was resistant to vaccines. So Americans paid for that through the NIH under Fauci's authorization, and the research was performed at the Chinese Wuhan Institute of Virology laboratory. That was published several times, but the one article that I'm particularly familiar with was published in 2016. It was an impossible job. No, it wasn't an impossible job. So this was even if it came from a lab, which I think it probably did, it was still a rather mild, for most people, respiratory virus. Sure, it killed somebody, but people die from respiratory infections all the time. The pre-vaccine case fatality ratio or case mortality rate was actually quite low. So this was not some big, major infectious disease concern through its kind of normal state of being, so to speak. So they took something that was an infection that obviously did affect and did kill some people, and then of course they blew up the numbers by amplifying the test results, making everybody get tested all the time, and falsifying the diagnostic criteria. Falsifying diagnostic criteria means that if you had a positive test result based on a test that was designed and proven to be fraudulent and was already contaminated before it even left the manufacturing facility, then based on those massively inflated numbers, then they could call it, a global health disaster. So let's look at this. Was it an impossible job? Absolutely not. So, I mean, that's the part that already started to frustrate me just by looking at this. Let me see if I can make that a bit bigger. Yeah. So it was not an impossible job. They just screwed it up. Make one man the face of public health amid unprecedented pandemic in a country as fractious as the United States, and there were bound to be disappointments and frustrations. They were bound to get personal. Who cares about any of that? So they're already starting to kind of cloud the topic, in my opinion. Make one man the face. I mean, my God, he's been the head of this department for what, 40 years, something like that? So all of this was planned ahead. If it was stupid at the time of the event, then it was stupid for the previous 40 years to let this guy be in charge of it. Now they're saying, oh, well, it was an impossible task. Well, why give him the job if it's impossible? They predicted that this was going to happen years, or at least a year before it happened. So if they were tasked with the job and they knew they knew that this calamity was going to happen, then that doesn't get them off the hook. It just shows that that's another failure on their part. So here, maybe I'll do it this way. When they screw something up, I'm going to try to categorize my responses to this, I guess, in a few different ways. So let's see. I think I'll do F for failure on their part, and I think I'll do maybe an X for something that appears to me as complete corruption. So let's start with an F. He gets an F here. Make one man the face of public health. That was their plan, and they did that, and they all knew it. So they get another F for that. Sorry, where are my Fs? Are my Fs not showing up? Maybe should be showing up. Oh, it disconnected. Come on now. There we go. All right, so he got two Fs. One is, it wasn't impossible. And number two, sorry, there's my contractor. Number two, it wasn't impossible, and their policy was to make it. Oh, so they're going to come over in about 20 minutes. Their policy was to make it such that one person was in charge. So, here's the fraud already. They're frauding the scope of the problem, and they're frauding their infrastructure. They're saying the scope was too big and our infrastructure wasn't ready. No, they knew what was, they set this up. They set this up. If it's a failure, it's because they set it up to be such. I'm going to go for another 15 minutes and then I'll have to stop the video, attend to my contractor who's thankfully showing up today, and then we'll take it from there. In a country as fractious as the United States, there were bound to be disappointments and frustration. Who cares about any of that? And things were bound to get personal. So they're already starting to make excuses. That's just garbage journalism. It's just stupid distractions. I'll keep that there. Still in December, when Elon Musk joked on Twitter that his pronouns were prosecute Fauci, it felt like, this horrible writing, it felt like the cresting of a turning tide against the man who had played essentially that role for the first 3 years of the pandemic. That role? At least 30 state legislatures have passed laws limiting public health powers in pandemics. This January, a month after Anthony Fauci retired, as the 40 years of complete wasting. It's just horrible. It's a good thing he's out of there. 4 decades head of National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, barely half Americans said they trusted the country's public health. So less than half. Barely half. Well, it's either barely half or less than half or more than half. What does barely mean? But let's just say half. It doesn't matter. I mean, he wasn't elected anyway, so people's opinion has no power. Barely half of Americans said they trusted the country's public health institution to manage future pandemic. Wall Street Journal named the Wall Street Journal named that as his legacy, sowing distrust about public health and vaccines. Named that being the previous sentence. Yeah, well, that is what he did, and it was a disaster. Earlier in the pandemic, the leftist magazine, The Drift, this is stupid. I'm going to give you a crash course in left and right, conservative, liberal, all that kind of stuff. You see those terms thrown around everywhere, but no one ever defines those terms, nor can they define those terms in any way that would be agreeable. So, for example, a person on the right might define what they perceive to be a person on the left, or what leftist policy is. But at no point in time will both groups agree on whatever that is. The point being, and the same is true the other way, if a person on the left tries to criticize people on the right and you ask them, well, what does left and right mean? They won't be able to tell you anything. What they'll do is they'll give you a definition that makes them look good and makes the other people look bad. Okay, well, if that's true, then these are just weapons. These are just grammatical weapons that people throw at each other and say, oh, well, you're a leftist, or you're a rightist, or you're a fascist, or you're a whatever. If they can't, if those terms are undefined, those terms, well, here, let me just say it. Those terms are objectively undefined. They are not defined objectively. Where you could say, oh, well, you're a leftist, and they would say, oh, yeah, well, by your definition, I am a leftist. Where people would have mutual agreement in the terms being used, that shows you that the terms don't mean anything. Anyway, this is stupid. New York Times is just pathetic. And I could argue that New York Times is right and left at the same time. So anyway, whatever. Mocked Fauci as Dr. Doolittle, and Representative Matt Gaetz, a Florida Republican, proposed that Fauci had blood on his hands. Upon the announcement of Fauci's retirement, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, also Republican, celebrated, grab that little elf and chuck him across the Potomac. Whatever. I mean, what does any of that have to do with any of this? So I'm going to give this a small x, but oops, sorry. Let me give that a small x, even though it's going to be a big X. I mean, all that's just wasting time. Wasting time, you know? If they wanted to say anything clear, then they would say it clearly, right? But they don't want to say anything clear. They want to jack around with these political games. And so this is what we get. Of course, there were mistakes and missteps, including some by Fauci. Well, I mean, no. So what did I say earlier? I would give an F for policy failure, and then I would put an X for major corruption. I got to give that a big X. Shoot. We just switched articles. No. I'm going to give that 2 X's. We're not talking about mistakes and missteps here. These are structural errors, policy errors, and clear evidence of massive corruption that killed people. We're not talking about mistakes and missteps. We're talking about manslaughter and murder here. So, I mean, look, we're in the adult world and we need to use adult language. Mistakes and missteps is not appropriate adult language for this conversation. These are not mistakes and missteps. Like when you're dancing salsa and you step on your partner's toes and you say, sorry. No, that's not the conversation here. Of course there were mistakes and missteps. That's dangerous. That is a dangerous misrepresentation of what happened here and the consequences. So even if they were mistakes and missteps, which they were not, you're still talking about murdering people. You're still talking about manslaughter. So the definition of manslaughter, which I read a few weeks ago, is any act, intentional or unintentional, that results in the death of another person when a person is directly responsible or they had the responsibility. Did he have the responsibility to coordinate America's response to the pandemic? Yeah, he did. He did that. That was his job. He was given that power. What he said became the law of the land, so to speak. So he had it. He had the responsibility. He took the responsibility. He was given the responsibility. He was responsible. People died as a result of his mistakes and missteps. So by definition, we're already at the definition of manslaughter here. We're already in the world of manslaughter, and you call it involuntary manslaughter. We're already in that league, and they're calling it mistakes and missteps. You know, it's like, hey, I just stepped on your toes while we were dancing salsa. No. To the country at what? Of course, there were mistakes and missteps, including some by Fauci. Describing the threat to the country as minuscule in February 2020, for instance, whoa. Or first advising against wearing masks. What? So now they're trying to see how they're flipping this thing around. I mean, this is hard to follow even when I'm trying to talk about it and analyze it at the same time. Face masks were totally stupid. So they're trying to defend face masks, and that's stupid. So hold on, I'm getting a knock at the door. See? ¿Están aquí? Okay, so they showed up a little bit early. So I will pause the video and we'll get back to it later.